The fastest way to lose a fortune is to build something on land you never truly control. The sound woke me before the sunrise did. Deep metallic impacts rolled across the water and echoed against the rocky walls of the cove outside my bedroom window. At first I thought it was a fishing boat dropping equipment. Then another impact followed. Then another. Steady, rhythmic, deliberate. I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the water and immediately felt my stomach tighten. A line of construction barges floated near the mouth of the cove. Workers wearing reflective vests moved across temporary platforms. Fresh wooden pilings rose from the water where there had been open shoreline only a week earlier. A partially completed pier stretched across the edge of my cove like it had appeared overnight. The early morning sun had not yet cleared the hills, leaving everything covered in pale blue light. Waves lapped gently against the shoreline. Seagulls drifted above the water. And in the middle of that peaceful scene stood a structure I had never approved. My name is Ethan Mercer. My family has owned that cove for 3 generations. Most people see it as a beautiful stretch of waterfront property. To me, it is something more valuable. Every shoreline marker, every submerged easement, every property boundary, every access agreement. I know them better than most people know their own neighborhoods, which is why the sight of that pier instantly told me something was wrong. I grabbed a pair of binoculars from the kitchen and stepped back outside. The structure was larger than I first realized. Much larger. Heavy timber supports extended from land recently purchased by the HOA. The pier pushed outward across the water toward an area they had been discussing for months during community meetings. A clubhouse expansion, a private marina section, a gathering space for residents. Patricia Holloway's dream project. Patricia was the HOA president and the kind of person who believed confidence was the same thing as authority. For nearly a year, she had talked about transforming the waterfront into a destination. Every meeting included new renderings, new presentations, new promises about increasing property values and creating a world-class community attraction. Most residents loved the idea. Investors loved it even more. I was one of the few people who did not applaud, not because I opposed development, because I understood the paperwork behind it. By 7 o'clock, I was standing on the shoreline watching crews continue construction. The smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel from the barges. Hammers echoed across the cove. Workers moved efficiently while supervisors studied blueprints. Nobody looked worried. Nobody acted uncertain. They behaved like every legal question had already been settled. A black SUV arrived 30 minutes later. Patricia stepped out wearing a white jacket and sunglasses despite the early hour. She smiled as she walked toward the shoreline. The expression on her face belonged to someone celebrating victory. When she noticed me standing there, her smile widened even further. She raised a hand and waved as if we were neighbors admiring a community improvement project together. What Patricia did not know was that I was not looking at the pier. I was looking at the land underneath the entire project, and every piece of paper connected to it. The cove had always been the quietest place I knew. Even during the busiest summer weekends, the water seemed to absorb noise and return calm. That morning felt different. The steady thud of construction equipment echoed across the shoreline long after the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. I spent the next several hours reviewing records in my office overlooking the water. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the cove, giving me a clear view of the growing structure while I worked. Every few minutes another section of the pier seemed to appear. Trucks arrived. Barges moved supplies. Workers followed schedules that looked carefully organized. Patricia clearly intended to move fast. Speed is often useful when you want people to accept a project before they fully understand it. My office sat inside a renovated boathouse my grandfather built nearly 60 years ago. Along one wall stood metal filing cabinets containing property records that stretched back generations. Most people today trust digital databases. I trust original documents. Original documents tell stories databases often forget. By mid-morning, I had spread maps, surveys, easement records, and waterfront agreements across a large oak table. The scent of old paper mixed with the faint smell of salt water drifting through an open window. Outside, gulls circled above the cove. Inside, I followed a trail of ownership records that most people would never bother reading. The interesting thing about Patricia's project was not the pier itself. It was the land connected to it. Over the previous year, the HOA had acquired several waterfront lots surrounding the clubhouse expansion area. Residents viewed the purchases as evidence of progress. Patricia presented them during meetings like trophies. Every acquisition moved the project closer to reality. Every new parcel strengthened her position with the community. At least that was the story everyone believed. Around noon, I drove into town to visit the county records office. The courthouse sat 3 blocks from the marina, overlooking the harbor where fishing boats rocked gently against wooden docks. The building itself looked unchanged from the day it was constructed decades earlier. Inside, the familiar smell of paper, polished wood, and old air conditioning greeted me. A clerk I had known for years smiled when she saw me walk in carrying a folder. She knew exactly what that meant. More property research. An hour later, I sat at a public records terminal reviewing transactions tied to the HOA purchases. The pattern became clearer with every file. Patricia had not bought those lots outright. Very few organizations do. Financing supported nearly every acquisition. Mortgage notes, seller financing agreements, promissory obligations. Nothing unusual at first glance. Yet the deeper I looked, the more interesting the chain became. Several loans had been transferred between holding companies. Others had changed ownership through investment portfolios. The paperwork formed a maze most people would abandon after 10 minutes. I did not. Because years earlier, I learned a simple lesson. The most important detail in any deal is usually hidden several pages beyond where everyone stops reading. When I finally closed the last file and looked up from the screen, a slow smile crossed my face. Outside the courthouse window, sunlight reflected off the harbor water. Back at the Cove, Patricia probably believed. The next week became a celebration for everyone except me. Construction accelerated every day. From my office window, I watched crews extend the structure farther into the Cove. New sections appeared with astonishing speed. Fresh lumber arrived before sunrise. Concrete support materials followed by mid-morning. By evening, workers were already preparing the next phase. Patricia understood public perception better than most people. She knew that once residents saw physical progress, questions became harder to ask. A blueprint is an idea. A completed structure feels permanent. That was exactly the image she wanted. The HOA began posting updates across community newsletters and social media pages. Renderings became photographs. Promises became visible construction. Residents shared images of the project almost daily. Comments praised the future clubhouse expansion. Property owners talked about increased values. Local businesses discussed tourism opportunities. The excitement grew larger with each passing week. One Saturday afternoon, the HOA organized a public viewing event near the construction site. Food trucks lined the parking area. Folding chairs faced the waterfront. A large banner displayed a polished rendering of the completed marina and clubhouse complex. Music drifted across the shoreline while families gathered to watch presentations. I attended quietly and stood near the back. The smell of grilled food mixed with the scent of salt water carried by a steady breeze coming off the Cove. Boats moved slowly across the water beyond the construction zone. Children pointed toward the growing pier while residents discussed future gatherings and waterfront events. Patricia stood at the center of it all. Wearing a navy blazer and holding a wireless microphone, she looked completely at home. Every sentence generated applause. Every announcement created excitement. She spoke about vision. She spoke about growth. She spoke about transforming the community into a premier waterfront destination. The crowd loved it. Then she pointed toward the structure extending across the Cove. Cameras turned. Phones rose into the air. People recorded videos while cheering. Patricia smiled as though the project was already complete. In many ways, she believed it was. The physical construction represented victory in her mind. What fascinated me was not what she said. It was what she left out. There was no mention of financing. No discussion of acquisition structures. No explanation of the ownership trail behind the purchased lots. Most people never noticed the omission because they were focused on the pier. Large projects have a way of distracting attention from paperwork. That evening, after the event ended, I returned to my office carrying another box of records. The Cove was quiet again. The crowd had gone home. Construction equipment sat motionless beneath security lights. Reflections shimmered across the dark water. I placed several folders on the oak table and continued tracing ownership transfers connected to the project. Hours passed. Outside, waves gently tapped against the shoreline. Inside, a different picture slowly emerged. Every document seemed unrelated until viewed together. A transfer here, an assignment there, a holding company that appeared briefly before disappearing. The pattern became impossible to ignore. By midnight, I finally leaned back in my chair and stared at the collection of papers spread across the table. For the first time since the pier appeared, I understood exactly how Patricia's dream had been built. More importantly, I understood who actually controlled the foundation beneath it. And that realization was worth far more than anything standing above the water. A few days later, Patricia finally decided to address me directly. The opportunity came during a waterfront planning meeting held inside the Clubhouse conference room overlooking the marina. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the cove behind her like a trophy. The nearly completed pier stretched across the water in full view of everyone attending. Sunlight reflected off the waves, creating flashes of silver across the room. Residents filled every seat. Developers sat near the front. Local business owners lined the side walls. The atmosphere felt less like a community meeting and more like a victory celebration. Patricia stood beside a large presentation screen displaying updated renderings of the finished project. Applause followed nearly every slide. Expanded docks, private gathering areas, new recreational facilities. The audience loved what they saw. I remained seated near the back, quiet, listening, watching, waiting. At one point, a resident asked whether all legal concerns had been resolved. The question seemed innocent enough. Patricia smiled immediately. "Every important issue has been addressed," she said confidently. Several people nodded. Then she looked directly at me. "Even concerns raised by certain individuals who prefer the community remain stuck in the past." Laughter spread through the room. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to make her point clear. She wanted everyone to know she viewed opposition as an inconvenience rather than a legitimate concern. I simply smiled and said nothing. That seemed to frustrate her more than an argument would have. The meeting continued. More presentations, more applause, more discussion about future growth. Yet the deeper Patricia moved into her vision of the future, the more disconnected it became from the documents sitting inside my office. She was building a narrative around ownership. I was studying ownership itself. Those are two very different things. After the meeting ended, residents gathered outside near the waterfront observation deck. The afternoon air carried the scent of salt water and fresh-cut landscaping. Boats moved lazily through the harbor, while conversations drifted across the crowd. Patricia approached me holding a cup of coffee. Her expression radiated confidence. "Still worried about the pier?" she asked. "I am not worried about the pier," I replied. She laughed lightly. "Good. Because construction will be finished within a few months." Then she gestured toward the surrounding waterfront properties recently acquired by the HOA. "Everything is finally coming together." That statement stayed with me long after she walked away. Everything is finally coming together. The interesting thing was that she believed it. From her perspective, the project was stronger than ever. She had land. She had construction. She had community support. She had momentum. What she did not have was a complete understanding of how those acquisitions had been financed. That evening, I returned to the boathouse office. Outside, the cove remained calm beneath a glowing sunset. Orange and gold reflections stretched across the water. The partially completed pier cast a long shadow over the surface. Inside, I opened another folder from the growing stack of records. Transfer documents, assignment agreements, financing statements. Each page added another piece to the puzzle. Then I found the document that changed everything. It was not dramatic. It was not hidden inside a locked vault. It was a simple assignment record filed years earlier and largely ignored ever since. Most people would have skimmed past it. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. Finally, I leaned back in my chair and stared through the window toward the cove. For the first time, the entire structure behind Patricia's project became visible. Not the pier, not the clubhouse, the financial framework underneath all of it. And sitting at the center of that framework was a name Patricia never expected to find. Mine. The discovery should have felt dramatic. Instead, it felt quiet. The most powerful revelations usually do. There was no secret meeting, no hidden vault, no mysterious phone call, just a single assignment record connecting a chain of transactions that stretched back years. I spent the next several days verifying every detail. The cove remained busy outside my office windows. Construction crews continued working on the pier. Delivery trucks arrived daily. Residents stopped along the shoreline to admire the progress. Patricia appeared in local newsletters almost every week, smiling beside updated project renderings and promising exciting developments for the community. The more confident she became, the more careful I became. Confidence creates mistakes. Patience reveals them. By Thursday afternoon, I had assembled the complete financial trail. The process resembled putting together a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered across dozens of transactions. One financing agreement led to another. One transfer connected to a holding company. That holding company linked to an investment group. The investment group assigned rights to a private entity. And that entity ultimately reported to a company under my control. Years earlier, I had acquired a portfolio of distressed real estate notes through a series of investments that seemed unrelated at the time. Most people viewed those transactions as routine financial opportunities. They were. What nobody anticipated was that some of those notes would eventually become the foundation beneath Patricia's waterfront project. Late Friday evening, I sat on the deck behind the boathouse office overlooking the cove. The air carried the scent of salt water and cedar from the shoreline. Waves rolled gently against the rocks below. Across the water, construction lights illuminated portions of the nearly completed pier. Reflections danced across the surface like strands of gold. From a distance, the project looked impressive. I could understand why residents admired it. The structure projected confidence, success, progress. Yet appearances can be deceptive. I opened a folder resting beside my chair and reviewed the most important documents one more time. The acquired lots supporting the clubhouse expansion remained tied to financing obligations. Several payment requirements were approaching critical deadlines. More importantly, specific covenant conditions attached to the agreements had not been fully satisfied. Most homeowners never read those sections. Many developers ignore them until someone forces them to pay attention. I had spent my entire career paying attention. The following week, I attended another community gathering near the waterfront. Residents celebrated construction milestones while discussing future events they planned to host at the completed facility. Patricia moved through the crowd accepting congratulations. Several people thanked her for bringing the project to life. She smiled graciously and spoke about long-term plans. At one point, our paths crossed near the shoreline. The evening sun reflected brightly off the water behind her. "Beautiful, is it not?" she asked while looking toward the pier. "Very impressive," I replied honestly. She seemed pleased by the answer. "Soon it will belong to everyone." That statement lingered in my thoughts long after the conversation ended. Because the truth was far more complicated. Ownership is not determined by ribbon cuttings, speeches, or public enthusiasm. Ownership is determined by obligations, contracts, notes, conditions, responsibilities. And buried beneath all the excitement surrounding the project sat a collection of obligations nobody seemed interested in discussing. Nobody except me. Standing there beside the cove as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something Patricia still did not understand. She believed the project was entering its final phase. In reality, the most important phase had not even started yet. 2 weeks later, the first cracks appeared. Not in the pier, not in the clubhouse plans. In the paperwork, the morning began quietly. Fog drifted across the cove, while fishing boats moved through the harbor beyond the shoreline. From my office deck, the completed sections of the pier looked almost beautiful beneath the pale gray sky. Construction crews had entered the finishing stage. Railings were being installed. Lighting systems were undergoing inspection. Landscaping teams were preparing the surrounding lots. Residents talked openly about grand opening celebrations. Patricia seemed more confident than ever. That confidence lasted until the first certified letters arrived. I was not the one who delivered them. I did not need to. Attorneys handled that part. Procedures matter. Documentation matters. Emotions do not. The notices were straightforward. Several financing obligations connected to the acquired waterfront parcels required immediate attention. Certain covenant conditions had not been satisfied within the required timelines. Specific reporting requirements remained incomplete. Technical details. The kind of details most people ignore when everything appears successful on the surface. Yet contracts do not care about appearances. Contracts care about compliance. By midday, rumors were already spreading through the community. A board member contacted Patricia. Then another. Questions multiplied quickly. Residents who had never shown interest in financing suddenly wanted explanations. Developers involved with portions of the project requested meetings. Attorneys reviewed files. Accountants examined records. Everyone was searching for the same answer. How serious was the situation? I spent that afternoon aboard a small workboat inspecting shoreline markers along the western edge of the cove. The water remained calm. Gentle waves tapped against the hull while gulls floated overhead. My phone rang repeatedly. I ignored most calls. Eventually, one number appeared that I knew could not be ignored. Patricia. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice sounded different immediately. Less confident. More focused. Ethan, she said. I need to ask you something. I remained silent. Do you know anything about these notices? There it was. The question she never expected to ask. I looked toward the pier extending across the water. Workers continued moving along the structure, completely unaware of the conversation taking place. I know quite a bit about financing, I replied. Several seconds passed before she spoke again. The attorneys are saying ownership interests may be more complicated than we believed. More complicated. That was one way to describe it. You should listen carefully to your attorneys, I said. The conversation ended shortly afterward. By evening, emergency meetings were already being scheduled. The HOA board gathered inside the Clubhouse conference room. Consultants joined by video call. Financial advisors reviewed acquisition records. The deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the situation became. Because the trail I had followed months earlier was now impossible for them to ignore. Assignment after assignment. Transfer after transfer. Ownership interests moving quietly through years of transactions. The chain ultimately led to a single controlling position. Mine. That revelation did not arrive all at once. It arrived gradually, like a tide moving across the shoreline. One document confirmed another. One agreement validated the next. Every review pointed toward the same conclusion. Standing outside my office that night, watching moonlight shimmer across the cove, I knew Patricia was finally seeing the project for what it truly was. Not a completed victory. Not a guaranteed legacy. Not a permanent monument to her vision. It was a structure resting on obligations she never fully understood. And for the first time since construction began, she realized the person holding the strongest position in the entire project was not standing at the end of the pier. He was standing across the water watching it. The community learned the truth on a Tuesday morning. Not through rumors. Not through gossip. Through official filings. By sunrise, the harbor was already busy. Fishing boats departed their slips. Waterfront restaurants prepared for lunch service. Joggers followed the shoreline paths surrounding the cove. Everything looked normal. Yet inside conference rooms, law offices, and HOA board meetings, panic was spreading faster than anyone expected. The formal notices had entered their next phase. Compliance deadlines had expired. Financial obligations remained unresolved. Legal remedies were no longer theoretical. They were active. I spent that morning walking along the western shoreline where the cove narrowed before opening toward the harbor. The air smelled of salt and cedar. Small waves rolled against the rocks below. Across the water, the pier stood nearly complete. Sunlight reflected from its railings while seabirds rested on the outer pilings. To most observers, it still looked like a success story. That illusion finally ended around 10 o'clock. My attorneys called first, then county officials, then several reporters who somehow learned portions of the situation before the HOA managed to control the narrative. The legal process moved exactly as expected. Formal foreclosure proceedings were initiated against the properties tied to the outstanding obligations. Multiple lots connected to the waterfront expansion project became subject to enforcement actions. The language sounded technical. The consequences were not. Within hours, emergency meetings filled the HOA calendar. Board members arrived carrying binders and laptops. Attorneys moved in and out of conference rooms. Consultants reviewed options that should have been explored months earlier. Every path led back to the same problem. The acquired lots were never as secure as Patricia believed. By early afternoon, my phone rang again. Patricia. This time there was no confidence left in her voice. How many of them? She asked immediately. I knew exactly what she meant. Every parcel tied to the active filings, I replied. Silence followed. I could hear distant voices in the background. Advisors. Attorneys. Board members. The sounds of people realizing they were running out of solutions. "There has to be another option," she said finally. I looked across the water toward the pier. Workers had stopped for the day. Equipment sat motionless. Construction activity that had dominated the cove for months had suddenly disappeared. "There were always options," I answered. "Months ago." The conversation ended shortly afterward. By evening, the story had spread across the community. Residents who once celebrated the expansion now demanded explanations. Questions flooded social media pages. Local newspapers published updates. Property owners wanted to know how a project worth millions could reach this point. The answer was surprisingly simple. Everyone focused on construction. Nobody focused on ownership. Standing on my deck that night, I watched lights shimmer across the water. The cove looked peaceful again. Calm. Quiet. Almost unchanged despite everything happening around it. Then another call arrived from my attorneys. The final review had been completed. Every document matched. Every assignment was valid. Every transfer had been verified. The controlling position behind the obligations was unquestionably mine. For months, Patricia believed she was building leverage through land acquisition. What she never realized was that the leverage already existed. She simply built her project directly on top of it. And now the process she spent years creating was beginning to turn in the opposite direction. Not through anger, not through revenge, through the same documents she ignored when she believed construction alone guaranteed victory. The collapse happened much faster than the construction ever did. For months, the project had advanced one careful step at a time. Permits, purchases, construction schedules, public presentations, fundraising campaigns. Every phase seemed deliberate and controlled. The unraveling was different. Once the legal process moved forward, momentum shifted almost overnight. Within a week, the waterfront community transformed from celebration to uncertainty. Residents who once discussed grand opening events now discussed court filings. Local business owners who expected increased traffic began asking whether the project would even survive. Community message boards filled with questions. The same people who previously admired the pier now wanted to understand how ownership of the supporting properties had become so complicated. Early one morning, I walked along the shoreline trail bordering the cove. The air was cool and carried the scent of salt water and pine from the surrounding hills. Small waves rolled gently against the rocks below. Across the water, the pier remained exactly where it had always been. Physically, nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Construction equipment sat idle behind temporary fencing. Delivery schedules had stopped. Contractors waited for instructions that never came. The structure looked less like a symbol of progress and more like a question nobody could answer. Later that afternoon, county records reflected the next stage of proceedings. Several parcels connected to the expansion project officially changed status. The implications spread quickly through the community. Without secure control of those lots, the entire development plan became unstable. Parking areas, access routes, utility corridors, future expansion zones. Everything depended on land that no longer sat on solid legal ground. The problem was not the pier itself. The problem was everything supporting it. Patricia spent the next several days moving between meetings with attorneys, consultants, and board members. I occasionally saw her vehicle parked outside conference rooms overlooking the marina. The confidence she carried during groundbreaking ceremonies had disappeared. In its place was something far more realistic. Consequences. One evening near sunset, I stood on the deck outside my boathouse office watching orange light spread across the cove. The water looked almost perfectly still. Reflections from the pier stretched across the surface like long shadows. My phone buzzed with updates from attorneys confirming additional developments. More filings, more reviews, more confirmations. Every document pointed toward the same outcome. The financial structure beneath the project could no longer support the vision built on top of it. Residents eventually began asking a question that should have been asked from the beginning. Who actually controlled the land? The answer surprised many of them. They assumed ownership belonged to whoever held the ribbon-cutting ceremony, whoever gave speeches, whoever appeared in newsletters. Real ownership rarely works that way. Real ownership lives inside contracts, records, obligations, and assignments. It lives inside documents most people never read. As darkness settled across the shoreline, lights along the pier switched on automatically. Their reflections shimmered across the water, beautiful and almost surreal against the quiet evening sky. Looking at it, I understood why Patricia fought so hard to build it. The structure represented her vision of the future. The problem was that she spent years building the future without fully understanding the foundation beneath it. And now the foundation was shifting, not because anyone sabotaged it, not because anyone attacked it, because the paperwork governing it was finally being read. Standing there beside the cove, listening to waves brush softly against the shoreline, I realized the end was no longer a possibility. It was a timetable. The only question remaining was how much of Patricia's dream would still be standing once that timetable reached its conclusion. 6 months later, the cove was quiet again. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm passes and leaves the landscape exactly where it found it. Early one morning, I stood on the same balcony where this story began. The sun rose slowly above the eastern ridge, painting the water with bands of gold and silver. Gentle waves rolled toward the shoreline. Seagulls drifted overhead. Fishing boats moved through the harbor in the distance. Everything felt familiar, stable, permanent. Looking across the cove, it was difficult to believe how much had changed. The project that once dominated every community conversation no longer controlled the future of the waterfront. The foreclosure proceedings eventually concluded exactly as the documents predicted they would. Parcel by parcel, the properties tied to the failed obligations changed hands. Legal ownership shifted. Development plans unraveled. Expansion proposals disappeared. The grand vision that seemed unstoppable only months earlier dissolved under the weight of the paperwork supporting it. The pier itself remained for a time while various reviews and negotiations continued. Yet without the network of properties intended to support the larger project, it became something entirely different from what Patricia imagined. It was no longer the centerpiece of a waterfront empire. It was simply a structure extending into the water. The dream built around it had vanished. Residents eventually stopped arguing and started reflecting. Community meetings became less emotional and more practical. New policies required stronger financial reviews before major projects could move forward. Acquisition procedures changed. Oversight increased. Questions that once seemed inconvenient became standard practice. In a strange way, the community emerged stronger than before. Not because of the project, because of what the project taught them. Patricia remained in the neighborhood, but her role changed significantly. The confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by caution. I occasionally saw her during public events near the marina. We were always polite. Time has a way of removing anger from situations and leaving only lessons behind. One afternoon near the end of summer, I received a final package from my attorneys. The box contained closing documents, completed filings, and the last pieces of a process that had consumed nearly a year of my life. I carried it into the boathouse office and placed it beside the original records that started everything. The old surveys, the easements, the assignment agreements, the forgotten documents nobody thought mattered. Looking at them, I could not help smiling. Because in the end, those papers told the entire story. Not the speeches, not the construction, not the publicity campaigns, the documents. As evening settled over the cove, I walked down to the shoreline one final time. The air smelled of salt water and cedar. Small waves brushed gently against the rocks. The horizon glowed orange beneath a fading sunset. Across the water, reflections shimmered beneath the gathering twilight. It was peaceful in a way that felt earned. Patricia believed ownership came from what people could see. The impressive structure, the public support, the construction equipment, the applause. What she never understood was that ownership lives somewhere quieter. It lives inside contracts, records, obligations, rights, responsibilities. It lives inside the details most people ignore until those details become impossible to ignore. Standing there beside the cove, listening to the water move against the shore, I thought back to the morning I first heard construction echo across the bay. Patricia believed she was building the future. What she never realized was that every board, every piling, and every plan rested on land she never truly controlled. In the end, the cove remained exactly what it had always been, and every piece of paper that mattered still belonged to me.